Washington appears poised to enter what could be a lengthy shutdown.
I am proud to shut down the government for border security.
No further votes will occur until the President and Senate Democrats have reached an agreement.
White House officials say the president is not budging from his demand for $5 billion for the border wall.
President Trump, if you want to open the government, you must abandon the wall. Plain and simple.
The other big story of the day is lawmakers battle it out over border wall budgeting. The shutdown nightmare is likely to continue through Christmas.
So the next formal Senate session is scheduled for Thursday, but it's not just the shutdown fight that has so many people in Washington worried. The president is triggering, let's call it concern, as he floats the idea of firing the Fed chair, announces sudden troop withdrawals, and struggles to fill an unprecedented number of cabinet vacancies. CNN correspondent Ryan Nobles joins us live now from the White House. Ryan, the president is staying in Washington for Christmas, now canceling that trip to Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, that's right, Victor. Layla, good morning from Washington, where it is anything but calm and quiet here just 2 days before Christmas. You're right, the president of the United States choosing to stay here in Washington, which is rare for any president, not just Donald Trump, who often enjoys traveling to his Mar-a-Lago estate over the holidays. The president, in fact, his wife, Melania Trump, expected to come back here to Washington as well. And they are expecting to see the shutdown through the Christmas holiday because the Senate will not return to a formal session until Thursday, and that is because we are dealing with a stalemate here in Washington. Both sides not budging at all in their demands. The Democrats on Capitol Hill asking for a clean continuing resolution that would keep the government open until the first week in February, while the president is insistent that he gets at least some level of funding for border security, which would extend to the construction of that wall on the southern border. Now, initially, the president wanted at least $5 billion to begin that process. They've made some progress in negotiations. We're told that Vice President Mike Pence, the director of the budget office, the incoming chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, telling Senate leaders over the weekend that they would be willing to negotiate $2.5 billion for that wall, but that the Senate Democrats turned that number down. So at this point, it is a staring contest between these two sides, and neither seems to be in the mood to budge. And as a result, some 800,000 federal workers will be off the job through the Christmas holiday. Layla and Victor.
Ryan Nobles for us at the White House. Thank you. Now, one of the president's most outspoken critics, Republican Senator Bob Corker, joins Jake Tapper for an exclusive interview this morning. Be sure to watch State of the Union with Jake Tapper at 9 Eastern, right here on CNN.
Be an interesting interview for sure. Listen, first Defense Secretary Mattis, now another official leaving his post in the Trump administration after the president's decision. Another high-ranking official in the Trump administration has quit over the president's sudden decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria.
According to two senior officials, Brett McGurk saw the decision as reckless and could not bring himself to defend or execute it. The CNN Global Affairs correspondent Elise Labit explains.
Well, the U.S. envoy in charge of the fight against ISIS has resigned. Brett McGurk told Secretary Pompeo on Friday night that he would be leaving his post on December 31st. Now, McGurk was expected to leave in February to take up a post at Stanford University, but his decision to leave early came on the heels of President Trump's sudden announcement that he would be withdrawing all troops from Syria. Now, McGurk, just days earlier, was talking to reporters about the new U.S. policy to stay in Syria, not only to defeat the remnants of ISIS, but also to counter Iran. In fact, McGurk was in the region meeting with coalition partners to discuss this policy and was sitting with Iraqi leaders talking about the U.S. commitment to stay in Syria when President Trump tweeted that the U.S. would be withdrawing from Syria. And people familiar with McGurk's thinking say that not only did he feel his credibility was on the line, but also he didn't feel he would be able to defend, let alone execute that policy. McGurk has been the envoy dealing with the 70-plus member coalition to fight ISIS since 2013, first serving as the deputy to John Allen and then taking over as envoy himself. Clearly has done a lot to reduce the presence of ISIS. But as he said, there are still remnants, and he said it would be reckless for the U.S. to withdraw precipitously. I'm also told that the decision by James Mattis, who he was very close to, affected his decision. McGurk saying that he could no longer serve the president in this policy against Syria. Elise Labott, CNN, Washington.
Thanks, Elise. Now, for more on this, let's bring in the CNN political analyst and Princeton University historian and Professor Julian Salazar and commentary writer and editor for the Washington Examiner, Siraj Hashmi. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Siraj, first, I'm going to start with you. The president tweeted this. Let's go ahead and take a look to remind our viewers. He says, Brett McGurk, who I do not know, was appointed by President Obama in 2015, was supposed to leave in February, but he just resigned prior to leaving. Grandstander, the fake news is making such a big deal about this nothing event. So President Trump is essentially admitting to not knowing the guy leading the fight against ISIS after declaring they were defeated. Stop me if I'm wrong here, but shouldn't they have been having these conversations? Shouldn't there be briefings that would have him know who McGurk was?
Quite possibly. I mean, right now, President Trump isn't really doing himself any favors by withdrawing 2,000 troops from Syria. And basically, it should give Americans pause when Russian President Vladimir Putin, the Iranian Ayatollah Khamenei, as well as Bashar al-Assad, claim this as a victory. I mean, with respect to McGurk's role in defeating ISIS, or at least 99% of ISIS, cannot be understated. Now, it's possible that he might be inflating his own significance, but he did get Turkey on board with basically trying to stave off defeating the Kurds, and the Kurds were absolutely integral and critical in defeating ISIS, and they lost upwards of 10,000 troops in fighting ISIS. So the fact that President Trump doesn't know who McGurk is probably isn't a good sign, but again, he's the commander-in-chief, and I don't expect him to know who everybody is in the federal government.
All right, so we're talking about ISIS here. Julian, McGurk stood in front of reporters at a State Department briefing not long ago, possibly his last statements on public statements anyway, before Trump's tweet, saying that ISIS was defeated. That's what Trump says. And he promised that America was in the fight for the long haul. Let's take a listen to that.
Nobody is saying that they're going to disappear. Nobody's that naive. So we want to stay on the ground to make sure that stability can be maintained. I think it's fair to say Americans will remain on the ground after the physical defeat of the caliphate until we have the pieces in place to ensure that that defeat is enduring.
All right, so Trump says defeated, McGurk says not defeated. No one is that naive. Who's right here? How do we see ISIS in terms of how strong they are right now?
Well, look, it's clear that they have been weakened over time, starting with the Obama administration right through today. The United States has made a lot of progress. It's also clear they haven't gone away. And many officials are saying this is not over. The risk remains. The battle continues. And so President Trump really seems to be the outlier here. And his own officials had been saying otherwise. So that's part of what's going on with the reaction to the pullout. Part of this is about substance, opposition to the pullout, and part of it is about process. When there is no clarity on what has to happen next, the idea of suddenly doing this in impromptu fashion, leaving allies, not knowing what's going on, for him, for Mattis, was really a huge mistake.
And we see that the gunman in the Christmas market in France pledged allegiance to ISIS, and 2 Scandinavian hikers were beheaded by killers pledging allegiance to ISIS. You know, ISIS has a way of spreading mistrust for the U.S. They constantly in propaganda say these are guys you can't trust, they will abandon you. Does that impromptu, as you said, Julian, leaving of troops in Syria sort of play into that narrative? And should we expect ISIS to use that to try to recruit people in the future?
Well, they will. It looks like ISIS will use whatever they can to recruit people, and we have to remember there's the threat of the body of ISIS, which has diminished, and then the lone wolves who pledge allegiance to ISIS, which obviously can happen anywhere in the world. But the key to taking that on is to have strong alliances. It's to maintain really close relations with other countries so that we can locate and find where the threats are. And that's what was so troublesome about doing this to allies, not really telling them what the United States is out and doing. So that's the basis of the critique.
All right, Suraj, transitioning here to the government shutdown. It'll last at least until next Thursday. The Senate has adjourned with little expectation of a quick deal. Where do we find middle ground here? How do you see it?
Well, right now, President Trump did himself a huge service by at least shutting the government down for his base. Now, if he caved on funding for the border wall, that is a huge concession to make, especially given earlier this year when he didn't get any funding for the wall. He got $1.6 billion for border security, but not funding of the actual construction wall. With respect to his actual base, there won't be a second term if he doesn't at least get a little bit of funding to help start construction of the wall. So just the fact that he's actually fighting for it is a good sign for him. Now, again, if this bleeds into January and the Democrats take control of the House, he might have a steeper hill to climb. But with respect to, federal governments being furloughed, there's obviously the promise that they'll get back pay. Maybe some of them might get their paychecks a little bit late. But this is, right now, politically speaking, working out to the president's favor, probably better than he expected.
Julian, your take?
Well, perhaps, but I think there's also many Republicans who are not happy with this. This is not what they wanted. They didn't want this to happen during unified Republican control of government. And I do think there's a lot of concern politically in terms of how this affects the standing of the party. And it's also a question of governance. Put politics aside, kind of regular government shutdowns, which seems to be a norm in the Trump era, is not good governance. The president has the power now to move this forward, to reach a deal. And so the question is, does he do that, or does he continue to stand his ground over what is essentially a monument? It's not about border security. This is really a monument. And I think that's where many Democrats feel they are taking him on.
Third shutdown this year. Julian Salazar and Suraj Hashmi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
New Jersey state civil rights officials are looking into an incident during which a high school's referee told an athlete he had to cut his locks or forfeit a wrestling match. The video of the wrestler submitting to this haircut right there next to the mat, it's since gone viral. This happened on Wednesday in Buena, New Jersey, and CNN's Polo Sandoval has details.
The school district has been told that the referee in question will not be officiating any matches at that particular high school campus until a review of his actions has been performed. We should also mention that the New Jersey Attorney General's Civil Rights Division now investigating this, looking into the possibility that bias was a factor in Wednesday's incident. The school district offering a timeline of what happened here. The varsity wrestler stepped onto the mat to compete before the referee told him that his hair length and also his headgear were not in compliance with regulations. Well, faced with the option of forfeiting the match, the school district says the wrestler then agreed to have his hair cut right there on the spot. The district saying that none of its staff influenced the student in his decision. The district also pointing out that the referee in question does not actually work for them, but instead is part of New Jersey's State Interscholastic Athletic Association, or the NJSIAA. That's basically the governing body that oversees high school athletics. The question that the school district, that the NJSIAA, and mainly the state AG Civil Rights Division are now working to answer is, was this a case of bias? Usually that athletic association would investigate these kinds of incidents between coaches and staffs, etc. But in this case, it is the state Attorney General's Office's Civil Rights Division that will be taking the reins, since the referee is technically a member of that athletic association. On Saturday, the executive director of that athletic association added a personal touch in the statement that he released, Larry writing in part, and I quote, "As an African American and parent, as well as a former educator, coach, official, and athlete, I clearly understand the issues at play, and probably better than most. The NJSIAA takes this matter very seriously, and I ask that everyone respect the investigatory process related to all parties involved. We should note that CNN has actively reached out to not only the parents of this varsity wrestler, but also to the referee in question. We are yet to hear back. Polo Sandoval, CNN, New York.
New York Times paints a picture of President Trump as well, just being lonely. The author interviewed 30 current and former staff members, many of whom say the president is as confident in himself as ever and trusts almost no one around him.
So this piece, a war waged every day, waged increasingly alone. That's the name of it. CNN's chief media correspondent, Brian Stelter, joins us now. Brian, this is really a really dark portrait of the president being erratic at several intersections.
It is. Dark is an excellent word for it. We're hearing more and more accounts of the president being isolated. And this latest one from Maggie Haberman and Peter Baker in the New York Times is especially worrisome. Whether, no matter what you think about politics or the president, some of this detail is worrisome. Here's one of the quotes from the story describing Trump being hard on his staff, citing Larry Kudlow, for example. It says Trump can be hard on his staff. He regularly curses at them. Some say even his humor can be abrasive. When Larry Kudlow, his economics advisor, returned after a heart attack this year, the president ribbed him in front of aides, saying, "Larry, you're here 6 weeks and you've had a heart attack?" Others laughed uncomfortably. The point about cursing comes up repeatedly in the story as well. The New York Times not quoting the curse words, but saying they happen frequently. And here's another portion of the story that stood out to me as someone who's interested in the president's media diet. We know he watches a lot of television. He's probably already up right now watching television. Here's part of what the story says about his increased television consumption. It says at the midpoint of his term, Mr. Trump has grown more sure of his own judgment and more cut off from anyone else's than at any point since taking office. He spends ever more time in front of a television, often retreating to his residence out of concern that he is being watched too closely. And as he sheds advisors at a head-spinning rate, he reaches out to old associates, complaining that few of the people around him were there at the beginning. We know, of course, that turnover at the top of the Trump administration has reached 65%, according to the Brookings Institute. The detail about him being worried about people watching him, it suggests a kind of paranoia. The Times story doesn't directly say that, but certainly hints at it throughout the story. And look, it's not just the New York Times. The Washington Post, CNN, and other outlets have had new reporting along these same lines recently, describing the president feeling isolated as he's making these decisions that are causing a lot of blowback, as he's forcing a government shutdown, et cetera, et cetera. You would hope we'd be heading into a Merry Christmas season, but instead the president seemingly kind of alone at the White House. It's nice at least that Melania and his son Barron are coming home from Mar-a-Lago for Christmas to be with him.
But, you bring up the shutdown. He talks about the Democrats taking over the House, or excuse me, the article talks about the Democrats taking over the House, saying that he was happy that they won, and privately told associates that he is glad Democrats won on the House in last month's midterm election, saying he thinks that guarantees his re-election because they will serve as useful antagonists. You think we'll really see that sort of play out? I guess I wouldn't be too shocked.
Yeah, and does that outweigh their now subpoena power and their ability to have some oversight over this president?
Right. I believe that the president is saying that to his friends and his colleagues in private. He is certainly able to rationalize pretty much any situation and find a positive for him in it. It's the power of positive thinking, perhaps. But we know that he changes his tune from day to day or even from minute to minute on Twitter, so I don't always put too much stock in those claims. I think it is notable in the last few days, we've seen the hashtag Trump resign trending. We've seen editorials in major papers expressing more concern than ever before. So we have these two counter forces at the same time. One is he may feel more optimistic. He may feel that the Democrats are going to overreach and help him in 2020. Well, at the same time, we have an incredible amount of noise on the left demanding that this presidency come to an end.
Speaking of the noise, I think the way that this pretty lengthy piece ends is quite poignant, in which they quote a former undersecretary at this administration working under former Secretary of State Tillerson, and the quote here is, "What I'm trying to figure out is where does it end? The language gets coarser on all sides. The respect for the office of the presidency seems less to me than it was. How do we move people back, or are we in a new reality?" A question that I think a lot of us are asking, especially as we go into that 2020 cycle.
Right, are we in a new reality? This is the conversation I have with friends all the time. Is there going to be a post-Trump that feels more normal, goes back to pre-2016, or is there no such thing as that anymore? And is it all this way from now on? We see a lot of the Democratic contenders in 2020 taking positions on that right now. Beto O'Rourke and others coming out with comments and speeches and essays trying to stake a claim to that argument, whether there is a new normal or not. The idea that the president leads by his gut is something that comes up in the Washington Post this morning as well. The idea that, he says, I go by my gut. Other people have thoughts in their brains, but my gut is the best. That's going to be tested in the next 2 years like it never has been before.
Brian Stelter, good to have you.
Thanks.
Do not miss Stelter's show.